Welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. My name is Chris Hume, and I'm joined today in our office here by Barry Barkley, who is the Lancaster area chapter leader for the John Birch Society. So Barry's joining us, and we're going to be talking about the John Birch Society, what they do, what they're all about, and also Lancaster County, particularly what they have going on here, and what concerns Barry has for the county, and how he believes that, you know, the values that are being presented by the society can potentially help the county. So Barry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the Lancaster Patriot being a conservative newspaper, and it's so frustrating to see the left dominating so many things that I really appreciate the newspaper. I appreciate that you run our monthly meeting schedule and in the newspaper, and appreciate this opportunity.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about the John Birch Society. I have a handout here. It says, less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. So can you kind of just summarize, for those of us who have no idea what the John Birch Society is, what it is and what it's all about?
Absolutely. In May of 2019, I started a chapter of the John Birch Society, meeting at Loxley's, and we have now grown to two more chapters, one in Chester County and one to our west Hanover area. But the society was founded in 1958 by Robert Welch. He gathered a small group of businessmen and professional leaders to start a nonpartisan education and action organization to restore and preserve freedom under the United States Constitution and explore and rout out those forces working to enslave mankind. Robert Welch was an expert in the efforts of the left and what was undermining our country in 1958. So we believe the American system of government, we're a constitutional republic. It absolutely infuriates me that the term democracy is constantly used by even the conservative media when we are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. And we believe that's the finest system of government developed by man. The traditional moral values of the Judeo-Christian heritage form the cornerstone of Western civilization, and the family is the basic and most vital unit of society. We believe the free market system, competitive capitalism, and private enterprise afford the widest opportunity and the highest standard of living for all. We believe in the dignity of the individual. The society welcomes and enjoys participation in its ranks of individuals from every walk of life, all ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds. Our common bond is the love for liberty and our rejection of totalitarianism under any label, whether it be communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism. The rights of the individual, we believe, are endowed by his creator, not by governments, that the proper function of government should be limited to the protection of rights to life, liberty, and property, and that the individual rights are inseparably linked to individual responsibility. Because of our Declaration of Independence, which says we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights from God, we know that governments are formed, but our individual rights don't come from government, they come from God. And therefore, it would be sad if our kids in public school don't understand the nature of God. How can they really appreciate the real nature of our country as laid out in the Declaration of Independence? And we believe patriotism is based on principle, not on pragmatism, personality, or partisan politics. So that's kind of a nutshell of what we believe.
So, what got you into the society?
I've been a member for 47 years, and a friend of mine at work in Oswego, New York, was a Bircher, and he provided me information, and that's how I got started. Ran a chapter in Ohio, Northern Ohio, and then was somewhat inactive, but then when we moved to Lancaster, 2019, I started the Lancaster chapter with about 8 people.
Okay.
And now we have 3 chapters, and I have a mailing list of real patriots and chapter members of about 300 and like 75 chapter members, more or less, that come and go, and but we're growing nicely.
Now, what are some? You mentioned a lot of things there. Maybe we can get into some of them. But as you think about Lancaster County, part of America, the whole these issues that are happening. I mean, what are some things that just jump out to you right away as you look at our county and our nation that you see these are things that the John Birch Society teaches on, and we really need to hear about? What's concerning you most right now?
Well, one of our primary focuses is on our congressman. Congress is the organization that has to provide all funding. And if we can guarantee that we have a constitutionalist congressman in every congressional district, we could change the destruction of America around. So we work on our local congressman. We produce a scorecard for Congressman Schmucker, and the Chester County and does for their congressman, who is a total leftist who votes wrong every time. We have Congressman Schmucker voting roughly 60% on our Freedom Index, which means he's a typical Republican, not a 100%er like people like Rand Paul, Mike Lee, or Congressman Tom Massey of Kentucky.
Right.
Those are our great people. The Democrats score 0 to 10%.
Okay.
And they are totally consistent. We don't have any Democrat that breaks that mold. They might be 20% on some of them. But,
Okay.
So we want to force Congressman Schmucker to move toward 100%. And so that's one of our efforts. But we're also involved with all sorts of topics, and we're working with the state of Pennsylvania right now on the Constitutional Convention. Article 5 of the Constitution is another way to amend the Constitution. We've had 27 amendments, all done through the normal method where Congress proposes an amendment and then that is ratified. The Article 5 Convention, however, is a very dangerous proposition where you could literally change the document, throw out the Constitution. We have 4 different constitutions written by leftists and others. We even have a conservative constitution, which is likewise an abomination because it would legitimize things that the Constitution, say the 10th Amendment, says the federal government shall not do. It belongs to the states or to the people. So we are fighting an extraordinary effort by the Convention of States people, Mark Meckler, well-funded. My representatives in Harrisburg that I've met with and talked to say they are overwhelmed with lobbyists and emails and letters from the Convention of States. And the Convention of States also has national conservatives like, I think, Hannity, certainly Mark Levin, and so these people are promoting the most dangerous possible thing. There's no way to control a constitutional convention. And the left is really behind it. I think that's who's behind Mark Meckler, because they want a constitutional convention. It can be for term limits or for balanced budget, but it can be easily transformed into something else. And that was done exactly when in 1778, when our Articles of Confederation were set up to be fixed by a conference that was called, and that wound up to be not amending the Articles of Confederation, but actually creating the U.S. Constitution, which thankfully we had patriots then, and it's a great document. But where are Thomas Jefferson's and Madison's and Jay in today's world? Can you imagine our politicians of today messing with the Constitution?
So you're saying there's a push to have a constitutional convention and write a new constitution. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
they need 3/4 of the states to ratify it, and Pennsylvania is in the throes of, for many years actually, of trying to get that approved in Pennsylvania. So they have a bunch of states to go, and the society nationally is fighting this across the country.
Now, what you mentioned the 10th Amendment. You mentioned there are things that there's a couple different potential constitutions. You mentioned one might give to the federal government powers that were not intended for it. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, for example, the conservative, quote unquote, constitution that has been written by an organization that pretends to be conservative has a provision to abolish the 17th Amendment, which is a direct election of senators. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful thing. However, what the document does, and Mark Levin's proposed amendments to the Constitution, it legitimizes something that is clearly restricted in the Constitution. For example, Article 1, Section 8 defines primarily all the responsibilities of the federal government, and the 10th Amendment then makes it clear that if it's not enumerated in the Constitution, it belongs to the states and the people of the states. Well, if you make a constitutional amendment that talks about funding and ignores the fact that the federal government is not supposed to be doing like 80% of what we are doing today, then you can actually legitimize things like the spending that Congress does, and you wind up with actually weakening the Constitution. What we need to do is follow it. If we would just follow the Constitution, we would be solve almost every one of our problems. And I have a list of 17 problems that we don't have time to get into.
So this
I would propose are solved by following our Constitution and exposing. I should talk about conspiracy. Let me just take a little side note.
Okay.
The establishment, I'll use that term, uses conspiracy to, in a lunatic, called conspiratorialist lunatics and fringe people. And yes, there are conspiracy theories that are lunatic theories, but the history of our world has had conspiracies upon conspiracies, and we major in the Illuminati. Started May 1st, 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria. They had to go underground, but we had the French Revolution of 1789, where we had Jacobins and Cercle Social and other organizations that were really Illuminati based that caused the horrible French Revolution, Louis VI losing his head and the Queen. Those kind of things are obviously conspiracies. And then we had Karl Marx and Engels funded to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. So we had them funded by the League of Just Men. So there's organization behind it. Stalin was funded by Westerners to start the Soviet Union. We have Hitler provided by funding and money from what we would call Illuminati type thinking. The Illuminati had two goals. One, world government, like a new world order, with them ruling everything, and the destruction of Christianity, or destruction of God. So we've had lots of conspiracies. The mafia in the U.S. is like a conspiracy, and then we are major educators on the subject of the globalists. One of the most prominent organizations is the Council on Foreign Relations. Their 4,000 members actually dominate our federal government, the media, Hollywood, the education establishment, and who'd I forget there? But both Republican and Democratic administrations are dominated with CFR people. And the CFR produces the magazine Foreign Affairs, and that defines for the followers what they think our foreign policy should be. But they are definitely promoting globalism. And how do you get to globalism? You do it like the way the European Union was formed. It started out as coal and steel market between a couple countries, wound up to be a common market, and then some other names until they finally became the European Union. It took them 50 years to get to the place where today the European Union has enough power to rule over countries and so forth. The Brexit by England pulling out and the weakening in France of the recent election shows that the people are starting to wake up. And Donald Trump was famous for saying, the future is nationalism, not globalism. So in this country, they tried to form a North American Union, that's Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., and that was to be established by 2010. The John Birch Society was very important in getting that stopped and exposed. And today we have President Trump had done a brilliant thing saying NAFTA is a disaster, and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a disaster. He attacked the World Trade Organization as why we have China so prominent today in manufacturing. He attacked the World Health Organizations, and he went to the UN and the World Economic Council and said, quote, something like nationalism is the future, not globalism. That would infuriate the establishment globalists to no end. However, Trump then let Mr. Lighthouser, who did the Trans-Pacific Partnership, create the USMCA, United States, Mexico, and Canada Trade Agreement. Now what that does, it creates the infancy of a regional government like I talked about with the European Union. Mm-hmm. So now a farmer or a businessman may have demands or requirements put on him by a regional government, bypassing our Constitution, bypassing our state and federal government. Yeah. So we want to get us out of the USMCA. We also want to get out of the UN. The United Nations is basically run by almost total communist socialists. They would never support America. They hate the fact that we all have private ownership of guns. They hate the fact that we have local police, not national police. And they have then authority over countries. So if the UN can exercise any authority over the U.S., that's dangerous. The only way that we can preserve our Constitution and Declaration of Independence with rights coming from God and the federal government being limited is to get us out of the United Nations, get us out of NATO.
Well, again, we are talking with Barry Barkley, the Lancaster area chapter leader for the John Birch Society. Barry, that's a lot of stuff that you've just talked about, a lot of important stuff, global stuff that we should definitely be aware of and I think concerned about. I want to hone in, maybe you have a list here of 17 national problems, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of them jumped out to me right away, and you mentioned communism, socialism, and you mentioned Congressman Thomas Massie in Kentucky, and I want to kind of bring those together to discuss education, because what I've found is there's a lot of people that say they're conservatives that will talk about the founding of this nation and things like that. They'll talk about freedom, they'll talk about liberty, and yet they won't touch government education. So Thomas Massie, as you're probably aware, is he put forth a bill, it might die and not get anywhere, but to abolish the Department of Education on a federal level. Now, I think it should be abolished federally, state, everywhere, and return it to the community, return it to the people. So I want to talk about that a little bit, because the Communist Manifesto, I believe you have points 1 and 10, and I don't know which one is which, but you have, I think actually the property is first and then education is 10th, where you have abolish private property and take over the education system. And we have a form of that in the property tax, which funds the education system. So can you speak on point 4 there, education, and what your view on that is, and where we are as a nation when it comes to education?
Yeah, the John Birch Society has a plethora of articles, information, studies, unbelievable resources for all these things, and education is a subject we hit heavily. I'll give an example. The Lidditz School Board, I think, met and had 80 people in attendance trying to get Lidditz to not enforce a health and safety requirement coming from the federal government, which was really mistitled. Well, it was really a mechanism for controlling mass and distancing and all that COVID stuff. And of course, the school board defied them and voted, I think, 3-2 to accept the federal government money and mandates. So what we have is you can't fix education with your school board, because their funding is coming from state and federal. And
Exactly.
If you got rid of the federal Department of Education, that would be a brilliant move. But we have leftist trained teachers coming from our leftist dominated colleges going to high schools and grade schools and indoctrinating with leftist ideas. So what the John Birch Society has said is education in our public schools has been a disaster. It has caused crazy things like critical race theory, LGBTQ promotion, and now even transgenderism. And they're producing kids that are probably atheistic and socialists and hate our country. So in other words, our public schools are, in that aspect, are a disaster. We say defund public schools. Have you ever heard anybody say defund public schools?
Amen.
You did. And that would create a large fraction of our students outside of public school. And how can you teach someone something if you don't let the student understand God and what the basic principles are? There's many ways to try to downplay public education. But the point is, our public education system is creating atheistic socialists.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is because you talk about that with a lot of people, or you talk to people and they'll say, well, how can we exist without the government running our education? And it kind of reveals to me that they haven't learned the history of the nation, because you didn't have this massive system of education, public education, government education, I should say, at the founding and the 100 years before that, when, even though we hadn't declared independence, I mean, we were operating as fairly independent from Great Britain. So this idea that, well, if we don't have the government educating us, then everything's going to fall apart. You see the same thing in healthcare. People just are trained to think if the government's not involved, everything will fall apart. And that really goes against kind of this tagline here under your heading of the John Birch side: less government, more responsibility. Because if you take the government out, you are going to have to be responsible as a community. And I guess some people don't want that.
Yeah. Yes.
They want the government to take control. So let's maybe touch on maybe just one or two more of these things.
Then the final sinister fact is the federal government funds these things, so therefore they have a right to control them.
Exactly.
So we have started with the states sovereignly funding the federal government until we got the income tax. And
Right.
now the federal government gets all the money and sends the money and controls things at the state and local level. Very unwise. The checks and balances of the legislative, executive, and judicial branch is important, but more important is state versus federal. And that has been wrecked by the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, and the income tax system back
Right.
in Woodrow Wilson's day.
Yeah, well, it's encouraging for me to hear this piece on education, because I think there's so many conservative voices that I think there's a lot of things they're missing, and I think this is one of the biggest piece, is this education piece. That we'll talk about small government, we'll talk about freedom, we'll talk about parental rights, and yet we will continue to support government education. So, plenty of other things on here. Anything else you want to touch on as far as...
One thing I should cover, and that is part of our training, our educational program, is to talk about the political spectrum. You have people on the right and people on the left. And there's some crazy confusion about fascism today. But the only way that makes sense is to look at the political spectrum with total government, 100% government on the left, zero government on the right.
Okay.
Zero government is anarchy, so that really can't exist. It's like a vacuum. But communism is 100% government. Socialism is government where they control and own the major services and industries. Fascism is government control without outright ownership, and that was Mussolini's Italy as an example. So we have actually fascism, a form of health in our country. For example, the federal government does not own the hospitals or the doctors, but almost half of their revenue comes from Medicare and Medicaid. The federal government absolutely controls hospitals and doctors on how they get paid for Medicaid and Medicare. And federal government has totally dominated the way hospitals and doctors get paid for COVID. So there you have government control without outright ownership. That's the definition of a fascism. That's almost 100% government. So fascism, Nazism, socialism, communism are almost 100% government. That is on the left. America is in the middle with between 0 and 100% government, with limited government.
That's interesting, because it's not the way it's usually presented. It's usually left versus right, and I think we miss the point a lot of times, that the right is often pushing big government just as much as the left, which is a problem. And so it's encouraging to hear that your group, the John Birch Society, is trying to educate people on the fact that we need to be self-governing. We don't want no government, but we want a very small government so that we can govern ourselves freely.
Correct. And the states would have a much major role. So the state legislators would have to really pick up some action. I mean, if we actually followed the 9th and 10th Amendment.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think I want to touch on this one here too, number 6 here, the national sin of abortion. And in parentheses, you have a Bible verse here, righteousness exalteth the nation, and then it's a reference from a Bible verse, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. So I think two verses there referenced. But let's talk about abortion real quick. I mean, I'm not sure what the position of John Birch Society. I am concerned with the compromise when it comes to abortion, that heartbeat bills is one thing, saying it's okay to abort a child that you can't detect the heartbeat. But then also we have the issue of what should the consequence be for abortion. And if we look at it biblically, it's clear to me that abortion is murder, and it should be prosecuted as murder. And that's another thing that I don't hear many conservatives saying. So I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Obviously, the John Birch Society is opposed to abortion. There's nothing in the Constitution that addresses it, because no one would have dreamed this would be something that could have happened back in 1776. So I think there's some Supreme Court action going on right now that could actually overturn Roe v. Wade, and then it would push that back to the state's level. So there's a case where something belongs in state hands, not the federal government. But yes, we are opposed to abortion. It does not promote or hinder globalism so much, so it's not that we major on that from a conspiracy perspective. But yes, we are very, and of course those quotes there show how we as a nation cannot expect to be blessed if we have abort 40 million, 49 years of abortion, and so many tens of millions of fetuses destroyed.
Well, let's talk a little bit. If you got a few more minutes.
Yes, I do.
So, you've mentioned the globalist agenda, and that seems to be one of the focuses of the John Birch Society, and kind of raising awareness of that. And when we mentioned abortion, I think the idea came to my mind of overpopulation, and the idea that we're being overpopulated. We don't have enough resources as a globe, as a planet Earth. We're running out of resources. We have too many people, and we need some power, some global power to control that, and to make sure we all can have our comfortable lives, because we're just filling up the globe too much. You want to speak on that? And has that been something that you've addressed as far as the globalist agenda at all, as far as their claims on the Earth's resources and overpopulation?
That is basically nonsense. The Earth has unbelievable capabilities. Plus, we have a sovereign God who ordains and controls all things. So that's kind of absurd. Note that China dropped their one-child policy because they need population growth there, and we know that Bill Gates and some of these people are avid promoters of we have too many people and the world doesn't have the resources, and that's crazy. That's crazy thinking, and that's more from a Christian perspective than a John Birch Society, as far as what we do with abortion and population control. Obviously, if government is limited, it would have no say in what our birth rate is. And
So I want to talk. Maybe this would be more your personal view than John Birch, and I mean I think that's fine. We're just kind of looking at some of these issues. For me, when I look at this nation, any nation, and policies and government, in my mind, and I believe that the Scripture is clear that every person, every institution should honor Jesus Christ as Lord, and that's going to be the only way the blessing comes. And one of my things is when I look at you mentioned the Constitutional Convention, when the Articles of Confederation were supposed to be revised. There was a delegate from Maryland, I believe, named Luther Martin, who went to that convention, expecting them to just revise the articles. And they ended up scrapping them altogether, and he wasn't too happy about that. But the thing that he said that bothered him even more was that you had a national constitution that removed the religious oath test. Because at the time, pretty much all the states, or at least most of them, had religious oath that if you're going to serve in the government of this state, you have to be a Christian. You have to acknowledge the lordship of Christ. You have to acknowledge the Old and New Testament. It's pretty amazing, some of those state constitutions. I think most people don't know anything about that. Even after the federal constitution, you had for years these states that would require their governors, their civil magistrates to affirm the Scripture, and that was fine because the federal government didn't have authority to get involved in that. But I guess my question here, and I know we might not have time to go into this too much, but one of my concerns with the conservative movement, and I am just learning about the John Birch Society now, and I'm very impressed compared to what you see in a lot of other movements where they're not talking about defunding public education, and they're not addressing these issues. It's basically just big government with a Republican label. So this is not that, but overall, though, my one concern, I think, is trying to restore the nation without expressly acknowledging Christ as king. And I think that was the flaw of the Constitution. That when the articles were scrapped and they removed that oath, Luther Martin said something to the effect of, "How can we expect people to govern this nation if they don't acknowledge God and that there's a future reward and things like that?" And so, and maybe this goes beyond the John Birch, but maybe as your personal thought. I mean, what do you think? How important do you see it as that when we are trying to change the culture and preserve freedom, that we do so from a specifically Christian worldview, acknowledging Christ? And that's a long question.
That's a tough question. And again, the Declaration of Independence says we get our rights from God. That provides the basis for how we recognize government. And yes, when we elect a representative, he needs to bring his faith with him into office and exercise that. And of course, the tough issue is someone is a representative and they have non-Christians that they are supposed to represent in government, but we need to choose righteous and godly men to be our legislators and our governors and our presidents. And so, yeah, that's quite an issue. We should be a Judeo-Christian nation, and of course there we're already allowing for non-Christian Jewish because they use the Old Testament. The Old Testament provides much of our government sources, like the three branches of government and the way we elect representatives and so forth. So that's Old Testament, so you can't necessarily always throw out the Jewish aspect of our heritage. Before we run out of time, I want to mention that we do have a monthly chapter meeting the fourth Monday of the month at Loxley's, and we also have a major John Birch Society speaker event coming up on May 25th at Spooky Nook, and that will be Tom DeWeese, who will be speaking there. So we're really encouraging people to attend that event, and you can.
Okay, yeah, we'll post some of that information when I get those dates, and
Okay.
maybe put that in the paper. Yeah, I mean, a lot to cover there. I mean, I hope we can maybe meet again. And I think, what you mentioned there, just to comment on what you said, you mentioned the Old Testament, and yeah, I think that when you look at, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, these people that came over to our nation and really gave us the heritage that we have. When they were looking at these things, they weren't looking at it first from a political standpoint, so to speak, but from a biblical one, looking at Old Testament law, looking at the scriptures. What is God authorized governments to do? What does God's law say? And then they were seeking to follow that. And I think that's what conservatives today have gotten away from. They reference the Pilgrims, but then they don't try to actually walk in their footsteps. So much more that could be said on that. Maybe we can have a follow-up real quick though.
Yeah, and just one comment. You specifically dealt with Christianity, whereas the John Birch Society has not required members to be Christians or Jews or anything. So we separate ourselves somewhat from the established religion of members, which we expect to be their personal thing, but obviously promote a godly Christian, Judeo-Christian heritage.
Yeah, and there would be, if you look at biblical law, there'd be certainly, even if you go back to the Old Testament, there'd be a place for the non-Jew in the nation of Israel and subject to just laws and fairness and things like that. So much more we could say about that. Really quick though, you mentioned Congressman Smucker, and he doesn't have anybody running against him this primary. So what are your thoughts on that? And are you, it might not be the role of the organization, but trying to get people to challenge, these incumbents. You mentioned his score was a 60%. Wouldn't it be nice if there was someone to challenge him during the primary?
Absolutely, yes. We have want to encourage our members to be politically active. We as a society would not endorse candidates or so forth, but we can certainly, which we do, publish their voting record. And so our mission, since Congressman Smucker will probably be reelected and there's no primary challenge for him, is to force him to fear the fact that we are exposing his voting record with our scorecards that we are sending him. We've met a couple times with Congressman Smucker and his office and said, look, here's the principles, and here's where you violated the Constitution. You swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And we know, yes, that almost everything coming out of the federal government today is not constitutional. So we have, 40% of his votes that we can challenge. How can you take an oath of office and then vote this way, which is a violation of Article 1, Section 8, and the 9th and 10th Amendment?
Well, hopefully he will respond to that, and perhaps I think the real solution as far as that goes will hopefully maybe getting someone to run against him and more people aware of the issues, more people aware of what's at stake when you allow the government to grow and grow and grow. So
here's a specific example to help visualize this. Congressman Smucker voted for, there's been like 3 or 4 different COVID spending issues, and he voted against the latter ones, but he voted for the earlier one or two. And that's a violation of the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows the federal government to have anything to do with local businesses or funding businesses.
Right.
And of course, his response is because of COVID, which was caused by government overreach with lockdowns, these industries needed it. So it's something that's needed. Well, your job is not to fix anything that's not in the Constitution. So if anything gets fixed, it's either states level, or you shouldn't be locking down maybe 2 weeks of the early 2020. There made some sense to try to deal with COVID, but the actual lockdowns of all these places, and then the mask mandates and the vaccination pushing is just absurd. And of course, the federal government spent this money, which is creating M1 money out of thin air. So what we've done is we've increased the amount of money, so our deficit spending is what causes inflation. So prices haven't gone up. We have devalued the value of our dollar with all this printed money.
Yeah, that was an alarm that Ron Paul had been sounding for some time about the defacing, the currency and inflating. So, yeah, well, Barry, thank you so much for joining me. There's so much more we could talk about. I think we should try to meet again and go through some more of these 17 items. Let me just mention a few of these things to give people an idea of this list of national problems. Is this from the John Birch Society, or is this yours?
I just created that from what's
that.
happening today, and we are addressing some of that stuff directly in a major way.
Well, just for our listeners, let me just kind of give them a taste of these. These are Barry Barkley's list of national problems. Massive deficit spending, and I'm not going to read all the details, but massive deficit spending and the resulting inflation, uncontrolled immigration, which is the deliberate policy of the Biden administration, the COVID fiasco, which we just touched on, education, which we've spent some time on, and it says defund public schools, so I say amen to that, election fraud, the national sin of abortion, the Ukraine versus Russia war, the fraud of climate change, the relationship of the U.S. with China, the Afghanistan withdrawal, treatment of the BLM riots versus the January 6th Capitol building demonstration, high levels of crime and defund the police movement, truth being called misinformation by the mainstream media and big tech, BlackRock and Vanguard ties to wokeism. We talked about the Constitutional Convention, the Second Amendment, and then the growth of the UN and globalism. So a lot there. So, Barry, we might have to have you come back and talk about some more of these things.
Okay, that'd be great.
All right, so for those who don't know about the John Birch Society, the website is jbs.org. Is that right?
Correct.
All right, jbs.org. And if you need more information about the Lancaster area chapter, I'm going to give them your email address. Is that all right?
Yes.
All right, it's blbarkley2@gmail.com. And I'll also have some information in the podcast description for that. But again, this is to visit the John Birch Society website, go to jbs.org.
And check out the Lancaster Patriot newspaper, because it is our meetings are given there, and our speaker in May that is coming.
Well, I look forward to attending one of those meetings when I can, and thank you for that, Barry, and thank you for your time.
All right, thank you.
The Lancaster Patriot Podcast is a production of the Lancaster Patriot, a conservative print newspaper serving Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and beyond. For more information and to subscribe, visit www.thelancasterpatriot.com.